Today we are going to cover Unit 7 in AP World History entitled Global Conflict After 1900. The first chapter, 7.1, is called Shifting Power, and really this covers 4 countries, starting with Russia, China, Ottoman Empire, and then Mexico, all of which experienced some change in regime during the early years of the 20th century, leading up to or during the Great War. So starting with Russia, the Tsars of Russia, the Romanovs, had been losing the confidence of the Russian people for about 50 years at this point, first with the loss to the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War, and then the loss to the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. And really, by the time of World War I, that was just the last nail in the coffin. Tsar Nicholas II was the Tsar at the time, and World War I was just a complete disaster for Russia. They lost so many people to the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and didn't really have any positive outcome from the war. So during World War I, you had this big revolution take place, starting in 1917, in which the Bolsheviks, they were an organization representing the revolutionary working class of Russia under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks were a communist group. Communists believe that, according to the theory of Karl Marx, the proletariat or the working class need to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie or the middle and upper class, the business owners, and abolish private property, everything held in common or held by the state. So this revolution ended up leading to the deaths of the Tsar and his entire family and the instigation of a Russian civil war, which led to the beginning of the USSR, or the Soviet Union. There was similar upheaval taking place in China around this time. The last dynasty of China was the Qing dynasty, and during that dynasty you have things like the Taiping Rebellion, the Opium Wars, and the Boxer Rebellion. And really the Qing emperors had lost the confidence of the Chinese people because they had kind of let their country become controlled by foreign powers, most of them European, and so the people rebelled in 1911. And the person who led this rebellion was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. This abolished the dynastic system, which had existed in China for about 4,000 years at that point, and since then China has not had a dynasty. So this instigated the Chinese Republic. Chinese Republic lasted from 1911 until 1949, when there was a second revolution where Mao Zedong made it communist. But at this point, we're just concerned with the 1911 revolution. Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles were democracy, nationalism, and livelihood. Now, he was only the president of the Republic for a few months, and then it came under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party, known as the Kuomintang. Then moving on to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire by the early 20th century had become known as the sick man of Europe because it had not industrialized as quickly as other European powers and was really on the decline. Well, a group called the Young Turks emerged to try to turn the country around, and they advocated for Turkification, which was an effort to make all citizens of the multi-ethnic empire identify with the majority Turkish culture, which also means submitting to Islam. And the Christian minority, especially people of the Armenian ethnicity, had a big problem with that, and so they were often scapegoated, blamed, targeted, and this certainly came to a head in World War I when millions of them were killed by the Young Turks in what became known as the Armenian Genocide. More on that later. Eventually, after World War I, you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing and becoming the Republic of Turkey. And the first president of the Republic of Turkey was Mustafa Kemal. He earned the nickname Ataturk, which means father of the Turks, and made a bunch of reforms in Turkey to make it more like a Western-style republic. And then there were power shifts in Mexico in the early 20th century as well. Mexico entered the 20th century as an independent nation, firmly under the control of a dictator, Porfirio Diaz. In 1910, Diaz jailed his political opponent, Francisco Madero, and this ignited the Mexican Revolution. The person who led Madero's military was named Francisco Pancho Villa. They defeated Diaz's troops and sent Diaz into exile and made Madero the president. And one revolutionary leader of the Mexican Revolution was Emiliano Zapata, and he began the process of redistributing land to impoverished peasants. The party that came about in 1929 and dominated Mexican politics until the year 2000 was called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. All right, moving on to 7.2, causes of World War I. Well, there were really 4 long-term causes of World War I, 4 trends that had been happening for about 100 years that really made Europe on the brink of war, and you can remember that with the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N. So there was militarism, which means the building up of your military. Industrialization meant countries could build up more sophisticated weaponry, and all of them are doing that. A would be alliances, so countries had all these secret alliances they thought would make them safe if they were ever attacked, but what that did is really made all of Europe break into war when it could have just been between 2 countries. And then I for imperialism, that is what really made this a world war, because all of these countries that went to war in Europe, they had colonies all over the world, and so people from all over the world came to Europe to do the fighting in the trenches with the Europeans. And then N would be nationalism, so nationalism, believing your country is superior, being willing to fight for it for that reason. So all of these were kind of simmering under the surface in Europe for a long time, but it really took a spark to light this powder keg, and that spark was the assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his name was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was killed by Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian terrorist, a part of the terrorist group called the Black Hand, who did not like the Austro-Hungarian Empire encroaching into his territory of Serbia. And this really ignited what became known at the time as the Great War. All right, a little bit more about the alliances. The 2 sides when the war started became known as the Allied powers and the Central powers. But even before the war started, there were secret alliances. For example, the Triple Entente, that was Britain, France, and Russia. Eventually, they became the Allied powers. And then there was the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And Germany and Austria-Hungary eventually became the Central powers, but Italy later on joined the Allied powers. Another nation that joined the Central powers was the Ottoman Empire. And later on in the war, the United States joined the Allied powers too. One more thing about nationalism, the concept of self-determination. That is the idea that peoples of the same ethnicity, language, culture, and political ideals should be united and should have the right to form an independent nation state. So after the war ended and you have the collapse of several empires, including Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, you had their former colonies saying, we deserve the right to self-determination or self-rule, to determine for ourselves how our country is run independently. But as we'll see, that did not happen. All right, 7.3, conducting World War I. At the outbreak of World War I, Britain was the only major power going into the war without universal conscription. Another word for conscription is the draft. That's mandatory enlistment in the armed forces, and many countries relied on that to populate their militaries. You have a lot of changes in warfare in the early 20th century, and the Great War was the first one where a lot of these new military technologies were used on a large scale. So for example, you have poison gas, one of the most insidious weapons in the new style of warfare. Things like chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, they were all used during the war, and it was later banned by the UN. Machine guns were also used for the first time on a large scale during World War I. Now for the first time you can have hundreds of bullets fire out of one gun, and you don't even have to be a good shot. You can just move it around and kill everyone in your path. Submarines could now go underwater and fire torpedoes at ships, and they didn't even see them coming. Airplanes were used for the first time in World War I, and they could drop bombs, artillery shells, poison gas on the enemy. The British developed tanks in order to protect troops as they moved across vast areas of difficult terrain and even over trenches with the ability to fire at the enemy. Speaking of trenches, that was the way that World War I was fought, was trench warfare, where each side would dig trenches in the battlefield, and they would hide in there and fight from there. And the logic was that you'd be protected by the earth, so it would lead to fewer deaths, but it actually led to more deaths because battles would just never end. No one could retreat or advance, except if you wanted to go into no man's land in the middle of the trenches, go over the top into the middle, in which case the other side would stay in their trenches and gun you down. So you just have untold millions of people dying in these trenches, and within a few months a stalemate had developed in which nobody was winning, but everyone was losing because the death toll rose higher and higher as the years of the war went on. The United States finally entered the war because of two major events. First was the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship, and it held over 100 U.S. citizens on it, and it was sunk by a German U-boat, which is a submarine. So this made Germany an enemy in the eyes of Americans, the idea that it affects us now, whereas the Great War really didn't affect us before. It was just a bunch of Europeans going at it. The Zimmermann telegram was 2 years later. This was when Germany tried to get Mexico to enter the war by promising to give back land that used to belong to Mexico that now belongs to the U.S., like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. And that it was the final thing that got America to enter the war. World War I was a total war, meaning that every nation's domestic population, in addition to its military, was committed to winning the war. Everyone was expected to do their part to win the war, not just the military. You were either making weapons at a factory or saving your food or buying war bonds, something to contribute to the war effort. Propaganda was another major component of total war. Propaganda is any kind of communication that's meant to influence the attitudes and opinions of a community around a particular subject by spreading sometimes inaccurate or slanted information. This was also a global war, largely because of the colonies that became involved. You had millions of people from Africa, from India, from Australia and New Zealand coming to fight in the war. For example, the Australia and New Zealand troops, called the Anzac troops, fought for the British Empire at the campaign of Gallipoli, which was in Turkey. The war finally ended about a year after the United States entered because of American air power. You see a big shift in the war, and the Allies gain an advantage. Then after the Battle of Amiens, which starts the 100 Days Offensive in 1918, the Germans are pushed back out of their trenches, which ended trench warfare forever. We haven't used it since, really. And eventually the Germans surrendered on November 11th, 1918. Well, from November 11th, 1918 until June 28th of 1919, for about 6 months or so, you have the great powers meeting at the Paris Peace Conference, in which they tried to outline a treaty that would officially end the war, even though the fighting ended back in November of 1918. So the Paris Peace Conference, you have the Big Four, which would be Woodrow Wilson, who was President of the United States, David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Now, Woodrow Wilson had a document called the 14 Points, and these were, in his mind, the 14 things that needed to happen in order for there to never be another world war. And one of them was the creation of a League of Nations, or an international body of nations to work out problems diplomatically before they could escalate into war. Now, the U.S. actually didn't join the League of Nations because Congress voted against it, but it was Wilson's idea, and it did come into existence as a result of World War I. So the treaty that ended World War I was the Treaty of Versailles, and this made a huge mistake because it was based on revenge rather than reconciliation. Instead of saying, let's put the past behind us, let's forgive our enemies, let's try to be friends now, instead, the Allies said, we want revenge. We want revenge on Germany specifically because they were the most powerful enemy of the Allies during this war. And so the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany. It blamed them for everything. It made them pay billions of dollars in reparations for damages caused by the war. They had to give up all their colonies, restrict the size of its armed forces, and this was not good. This led to the German people becoming very resentful, very economically desperate during this time period known as the Weimar Republic, which was between the collapse of the German Empire at the end of World War I and the rise of Nazi Germany. And during this era of the Weimar Republic, you start to have people turning to extremist leaders like Adolf Hitler because of the hyperinflation they were experiencing and because of the global humiliation that was the Treaty of Versailles. So while former German colonies are fighting for self-determination and former Russian and Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman colonies are trying to do the same thing, you have Germany itself really languishing under the Treaty of Versailles, which eventually led to World War II. All right, then moving on to 7.4, the economy in the interwar period. This is mostly marked by the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was a global downturn, not just an American downturn, but it started with the collapse of the U.S. stock market. You also have agricultural overproduction as a major cause of this global downturn, but really the entire world plunged into an economic crisis. One person who thought he had an answer was an economist named John Maynard Keynes, and his plan, sometimes called Keynesian economics, said that we should embrace deficit spending, which is when a government spends more than it takes in taxes in a time of crisis. One person who very much believed in Keynesian economics was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, when he became president a few years into the Great Depression, addressed the issue by putting forward his economic plan called the New Deal. And the New Deal tried to bring about the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for citizens who were suffering, including the poor, the unemployed, farmers, minorities, and women. Recovery to bring the nation out of the Depression, in part through government spending, and reform to change government policies in hopes of avoiding such a disaster in the future. The New Deal had many different components to it. Some were very helpful, others were not, but the Great Depression did continue for a number of years after it was enacted. It was really World War II that got the U.S. and eventually the world out of the Great Depression. You have continuing revolution taking place in Russia after World War I because the Russian Civil War started. It was initiated when the Soviets, or the Bolsheviks, took over the government, and then when they killed the Romanovs, the royal family, you have a lot of people fighting against them. So the two sides were the Red Army and the White Army, Red being for communist, and then the White Army was against the communists, but the Red Army did win, and this led to the initiation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, more commonly called the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union would exist as a massive empire from the 1920s until it collapsed in 1991. So the first leader of the Soviet Union was Vladimir Lenin. He was the leader of the Russian Revolution, and his plan was called the NEP, the New Economic Plan. And with this plan, he reintroduced private trade, allowed farmers to sell their products on a small scale, and allowed some economic liberties in order to bring the economy back after the Civil War. And then Joseph Stalin became the leader of the Politburo, or the kind of oligarchy, the power structure in the Soviet Union after Vladimir Lenin died. And Joseph Stalin was even more strict. He instituted a 5-year plan, and this was meant to transform the Soviet Union into an industrialized power. He did this by collectivizing agriculture. This is a consistent mistake you see many communist and socialist governments making. When you collectivize agriculture, that means the government takes all private property away from people, organize it into government-run collectives, or kolkhozs, as the Soviets called it, communes basically, and the government runs them. This almost always leads to famine because there's no incentive for the government to make a high amount of quality food like there would be for a private farmer who's trying to do it for profit. And then also there's a lot of incompetence involved usually when the government runs farms. So that was not good for the Russian people. Another thing not good for the Russian people was the Gulag. Gulags were labor camps or concentration camps where political prisoners or anyone else who resisted the Soviets would be sent to, and there were hundreds of gulags all across the Soviet Union, very similar to the Nazi concentration camps. Party rule in Mexico, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, remained in power throughout this interwar period. One leader of Mexico during this time was Lázaro Cárdenas, who led efforts at land reform to get more land into more people's hands. In 1938, Lázaro Cárdenas, his regime nationalized the country's oil industry, and the company called Pemex, or Petróleos Mexicanos, became the second largest state-owned company in the world. Then you have the rise of fascism in Europe. Several different nations embraced fascism, and fascism is something that appeals to extreme nationalism, glorifies the military and armed struggle, and blames problems on ethnic minorities. So in a lot of ways, it's not that different from communism, because both of them very much embrace an authoritarian government, not many liberties for the people. Now, fascists consider themselves to be far right, and communists consider themselves to be far left, but really the extremes aren't that different because they both very much oppressed their people. So in Italy, you have a rise of corporatism. The Italian fascist state, led by Benito Mussolini, who took over Italy in the 1920s, the state was based on a concept known as corporatism, which is a theory based on the notion that the sectors of the economy are seen as separate organs of the same body, and everyone should work for the state. Once again, just like communists say, everything is for the state. In practice, the fascist state imposed its will upon all sectors of society, creating a totalitarian state in which the state had total control. So just like Stalin had total control in Russia, Mussolini had total control in Italy. Mussolini then tried to resurrect the Roman Empire by invading North Africa. He seized Libya, he colonized Italian Somaliland, which is now part of Somalia, and he even invaded Abyssinia, or modern-day Ethiopia. So you have fascism rising in Italy with Benito Mussolini. Then you have fascism rising in Spain with Francisco Franco, and this leads to the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Republic formed in 1931 after the King of Spain abdicated his throne. But then in 1936, the Spanish people elected the Popular Front, which was a coalition of left-wing parties to lead the government. This led to Francisco Franco, a fascist leader, instigating a civil war. And he led a group of insurgents who called themselves nationalists, and the other side were the Republicans or the Loyalists, the people who did not want Spain to become fascist, but who wanted to defend the newly elected Spanish Republic. You have some foreign involvement because both Mussolini and Hitler were both fascists, just like Francisco Franco was, and so they wanted Franco and the Spanish fascists to win. So the Nazi Air Force, the Luftwaffe, contributed to Francisco Franco's efforts in the Spanish Civil War. One infamous thing that the German and Italian air forces did was that they bombed the town of Guernica in northern Spain's Basque region, and this was one of the first times in history that aerial bombings had targeted civilians, and it was immortalized in Pablo Picasso's painting. Eventually, Francisco Franco and the fascists win, and he becomes the dictator of Spain for the next several decades until his death in 1975. Now, Spain did not join Mussolini and Hitler in World War II. They remained neutral during World War II. You also have a rise of a repressive regime in Brazil under Getulio Vargas, but again, he did not join Hitler or Mussolini in World War II either. And one thing that he very much promoted, like most fascists, is hyper-nationalism, the belief in the superiority of one's nation over all others and the single-minded promotion of national interests. All right, 7.5, unresolved tensions after World War I. You start to have a process of decolonization after World War I, at least attempts at decolonization. Remember, imperialism was the trend leading up to World War I, and afterwards, you had the concept of self-determination, the idea that everyone deserves to determine for themselves what kind of a government their people have. But many European nations were not ready to give independence to their colonies, so what usually happened after World War I was that Germany lost its colonies, Austria-Hungary lost its colonies, and the Ottoman Empire lost their colonies. But that doesn't mean they got independence. It means they became allied colonies. It means they became colonies of Britain and France in particular. So the peace conference's big three, who were David Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, and Georges Clemenceau, they were not interested in giving the former colonies of the Central Powers independence, and so they established the mandate system to rule these colonies and territories of the Central Powers. And with the mandate system, you have each area becoming a new district of the French Empire or the British Empire. For example, Syria and Lebanon became French colonies, and Iraq and Transjordan became British colonies. From here, you have an ideology sprouting up called Pan-Arabism, and this called for the unification of all lands in North Africa and the Middle East to try to collectively see that they have more in common than they have different, and try to get rid of Europeans in their region and colonialism. Also, as a result of World War I, in 1917, you have the British government issuing the Balfour Declaration, and this stated that Palestine should become a permanent home for Jews of Europe. Those who supported a Jewish homeland were known as Zionists, and after the Allied victory in the Great War, many European Jews moved to Palestine, which Britain controlled due to the mandate system. This would eventually lead to this region becoming the country of Israel in 1948. There was also an anti-colonial sentiment in South Asia. The Indian National Congress, who was led for a time by Mohandas Gandhi, was really resisting British control of their country. One thing that made a lot of people believe that Britain needed to go was a massacre that took place at Amritsar in Punjab province in northern India, in which the British colonial government sent in the military and killed a group of unarmed, peaceful protesters. 379 people were killed, including children, and over 1,000 more were wounded. So Mohandas Gandhi brought about an idea called the Satyagraha movement, which means devotion to truth. And he embarked on a campaign of civil disobedience, basically breaking laws politely and peacefully in order to take the moral high ground, keep your dignity, and raise awareness to the injustice of certain laws. Gandhi became known by Indians as Mahatma, which means the great soul. He led boycotts of British goods. He led people on what became known as the Salt March, because the British had a law that says the Indians could not make their own salt. They had to buy it from the British, and so they marched to the sea and defiantly picked up a few grains of salt just in protest there. Well, eventually this worked, and after World War II, the British gave India independence, but immediately once the British left, you have conflicts between the Hindus and Muslims in India. And in particular, Muslim leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah insisted on a separate state for Indian Muslims who were in the minority, and they were scared that now with the British gone, the Hindu majority would oppress the Muslim minority. And so they insisted on creating a separate state of Pakistan. So India itself was split into India for the Hindus and Pakistan for the Muslims. Pakistan was run at first by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and India was run by Jawaharlal Nehru. There was also a nationalist movement in East Asia against the Japanese. Japan was really rising to power at this time. And in Korea, you have the March 1st movement, and in China, you have the May 4th movement, both of which resisted Japanese control of their countries. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, under Mao Zedong had been gaining power for a while at this point, and they had been fighting the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek. And this turned into a civil war, which lasted from the 1920s until 1949, with a break in the middle when both sides put down their arms to fight the Japanese during World War II. But part of this war included the Long March, in which Mao Zedong's communist forces embarked on a year-long 6,000-mile retreat, and about 9 in 10 of everyone who went on this march died. And yet, since they did survive, since some survived, they were able to regroup then, and eventually they did beat the nationalists. And that's why China became communist after World War II. So Japan invaded China in the 1930s and took over the part of China known as Manchuria in the northeastern part of the country, and they made basically a Japanese puppet state called Manchukuo. So in Asia, World War II really started before it started in Europe, because Japan was already invading places long before Hitler started to. Japan, when they took over not only parts of China, but also the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, Burma, numerous Pacific islands, they called the new Japanese empire, they called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. There's also resistance to French rule in West Africa. Two people in particular, Jomo Kenyatta and Leopold Senghor, they were African intellectuals who went to Europe to get educated, then they came back and advocated for independence and Pan-Africanism. They eventually became the leaders of Kenya and Senegal, respectively. 7.6, Causes of World War II. So the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany is really what started World War II, especially in Europe. So between World War I and World War II, Germany was under the control of the Weimar Republic, under which they had hyperinflation. Well, Adolf Hitler had served in World War I, and he very much hated the fact that Germany lost, and he vowed to never see Germany surrender again. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, in which he declared his extreme views of German nationalism and anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish views. He then started the political party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, and attempted to take over the government. Through manipulation, the Nazi Party instilled fear and panic in the German people, making them believe that they were in a state of emergency. For example, the Nazis staged a burning of the Reichstag, which was in the German parliament building, and they blamed it on radical extremists. Hitler openly promoted ultranationalism and scientific racism, which was a pseudoscientific theory that claimed that certain races were genetically superior to others. In particular, he said Aryans, or people of pure German ancestry, were at the top, and Jewish people were at the bottom. He advocated for an extreme form of anti-Semitism and filled his speeches with accusations against German Jews in favor of Aryans. When he came into power, he was elected as chancellor, as leader of Germany, and became more and more extreme and more of a dictator as time went on. But he implemented the Nuremberg laws, which were anti-Jewish laws, which forbade marriage between Jews and Gentiles, who are people who are not Jewish. These laws stripped Jews of their citizenship, unleashed a series of subsequent decrees that effectively pushed Jews to the margin of German society. So really the precursor to the Holocaust is starting already, even several years before the war even begins. Hitler then allied with Benito Mussolini of Italy by signing the Rome-Berlin Axis, and then he allied with Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact. And the alliances among these three nations created what became known as the Axis powers, the enemy nations during World War II. Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, is the night when the Holocaust really began. It was a series of anti-Jewish riots where every synagogue in Germany was destroyed, many Jewish people were killed, shops and homes were vandalized, and more than 30,000 Jews were dragged from their homes, arrested, and sent to concentration camps, the first victims of the Holocaust. Germany then started to take over territory. And when they took over territory, starting with the Rhineland, which was taken away from them with the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies responded with appeasement. They appeased him, they gave in to Germany's demands in hopes of keeping the peace, but this did not work because Adolf Hitler wanted global domination and he would not be satisfied just with small chunks of land. So after he took the Rhineland and the Allies did nothing, he then took Austria with the Anschluss, which was a political union of the two countries, and the Allies did nothing. He then took the territory of the Sudetenland, because he said most people who lived there, which was a part of Czechoslovakia, he said most of them speak German. The Allies said okay, and the Munich Agreement was signed when Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the UK, went to Germany and signed an agreement, the Munich Agreement with Hitler, that says, okay, you can have the Sudetenland as long as you don't continue to take over territory, and Hitler promised he wouldn't. Then once Neville Chamberlain left, he continued to take over territory and took over all of Czechoslovakia. So this empire that Adolf Hitler is creating, he called the Third Reich, which is the third realm, basically, of German imperial history. And once he took over most of Central Europe without ever having to fire a bullet, he then looked to Poland. And Poland lay between Germany and Russia. And so Hitler looked to Stalin as an ally, basically, as a way to help him take over Germany, because neither Stalin nor Hitler wanted to face each other's armies on the battlefield. So Hitler set his sights on the Polish port of Danzig, and signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact with Stalin, which said they wouldn't fight each other and they would work together to take over Poland, which is exactly what they did. All right, 7.7, conducting World War II. So once the Non-Aggression Pact was signed between the Germans and the Soviets, you have the war starting in Europe. And Hitler's military strategy was known as Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war, a way to quickly subdue the enemy by never stopping to regroup or let the enemy regroup, just moving as fast and taking over as much territory as possible. Kind of the opposite of trench warfare. Once Hitler was able to take over Poland, he then took over Norway and Denmark and the Netherlands and eventually France, in which he set up a new pro-Nazi regime based in Vichy under Marshal Henri Philippe Pétain, who was an aged World War I veteran. So about half of Europe then became under Hitler's control over the course of about a year of warfare. So by the summer of 1940, Hitler had extended his empire into Western Europe, into Northern Europe, into Eastern Europe, and then he set his sights on Britain. So Britain, for a while, really stood alone against Nazi aggression in Western Europe. Meanwhile, America still did not want to get involved. Just like we didn't want to get involved in World War I, didn't see it as our fight, similarly, we didn't want to get involved in World War II. But we still tried to help the British in any way we could without actually getting involved. For example, in 1940, the U.S. and Britain signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, in which the U.S. promised to deliver 50 destroyers in exchange for 8 British air and naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. Then we signed the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, where the U.S. gave up all pretensions of neutrality by lending war materials to Britain. And also in 1941, Britain and the U.S. forged a policy known as the Atlantic Charter, which set down basic goals for the post-war world. The Nazi plan to take over Britain was by air. They knew that the British Navy was very strong, had been for a long time, and so Hitler turned to his air force called the Luftwaffe, and the Battle of Britain ensued. So the Nazis bombed London for about 2 months straight, and they initially targeted military bases in the Battle of Britain. Germans turned to bombing British cities. Eventually, the British defeated the German Luftwaffe, the Royal Air Force, under the command of Winston Churchill, who was the new Prime Minister of the UK. Neville Chamberlain had stepped down because his policy of appeasement had failed, and Winston Churchill led the British to victory in the Battle of Britain and against Hitler. So once Hitler received a defeat, really his first defeat from the British, he then turned eastward and decided to invade the Soviet Union. Even though he had a peace agreement with Joseph Stalin, he still had no intention of keeping that. That was just a pragmatic move by him at the beginning. So he then invaded the Soviet Union in what became known as Operation Barbarossa. One of the biggest military engagements between Russia and Germany during World War II was the siege of Leningrad, which lasted 3 years. The Nazi army besieged the city of Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and millions died in this siege. Meanwhile, Japan is still taking over Asia, and they get America involved in the war when they bomb the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. America was trying to stop the Japanese war machine by cutting off their oil. They got most of their oil from us, so we stopped selling them oil. They retaliated by attacking Pearl Harbor. Then the U.S. gets involved in the war, not only against Japan, but also against Germany and Italy in Europe. The tide then turned in the European theater. Once the United States got involved, one of the first places we invaded was North Africa, because remember, Italy had invaded North Africa under Benito Mussolini, and with the Rome-Berlin axis, you had the Germans helping the Italians in their military campaigns. So early in 1942, the Allies were struggling in Europe and North Africa. General Erwin Rommel, who was the Desert Fox, they called him, he led the German troops in Egypt and threatened to take the northern city of Alexandria. But in the second half of 1942, the tide turned. The British defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein and eventually pushed them out of North Africa altogether by 1943 and got Italy to surrender. So halfway through the war, they're out of North Africa, the enemy's out of North Africa, and Italy surrenders. But the US and the Allies, they still have Germany and Japan to deal with. Well, the turning point of the war in Eastern Europe between Russia and Germany was the Battle of Stalingrad. This was the bloodiest war of all time if you count the total number of people who died. Close to 2 million people died in this 5-month battle in the city of Stalingrad. Eventually, the Soviet forces were able to push the German forces back and continued to push them back for the next 2 years until eventually Germany surrendered. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, you have the U.S. engaging the Japanese on various Pacific islands. They engaged in the strategy called island hopping, which was General Douglas MacArthur's strategy, on which the Allies attacked islands where Japan was weak and skipped those where Japan was strong. One big part of the U.S. effort against the Japanese was the presence of aircraft carriers. Now, the Japanese had aircraft carriers as well, but at the Battle of Midway Island, the U.S. sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and they never recovered from that. So this allowed both the Air Corps and the Navy and the Marines to all have a part in the battle in the Pacific. Another major battle in the Pacific that happened before Midway was the Battle of Coral Sea, when the U.S. Navy stopped a Japanese fleet set to invade New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and prevented a future invasion of Australia. All right, so the tide turned in North Africa at the Battle of El Alamein. The tide turned in Eastern Europe at the Battle of Stalingrad. The tide turned in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway. And then finally, the turning point of the war in Western Europe came on D-Day. D-Day was the beginning of Operation Overlord, in which the British, U.S., and Canadian troops invaded Nazi-occupied France at Normandy, which is northern France. That's known as D-Day, on June 6, 1944. And after that victorious day, the Allies were able to push the Germans back into Germany over the next 11 months, at the same time as the Soviets are pushing the Germans back from the other direction. So from that point, it was just a matter of time. The Battle of the Bulge was really the last effort by the Germans to push back against the Allies. It happened in modern-day Luxembourg, but then the Allies were able to defeat them and push them back into Germany. In July 1943, the largest tank battle of the war took place. It was called the Battle of Kursk, and this was between the Russians and the Germans. Finally, in 1945, you have the Nazis being surrounded by the Soviets to the east and the Americans and British to the west. Hitler commits suicide, and then the Nazis surrender. And this day is known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the island hopping continued. You have catastrophic battle after catastrophic battle. The Japanese would just never surrender. They would never stop fighting until eventually, after battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where thousands of Americans and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Japanese would die, finally, you have the U.S. using a new superweapon that American physicists had been working on for several years. This weapon, of course, being the atomic bomb, which was dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which eventually resulted in Japan surrendering. All right, last chapter of this unit, 7.8, Mass Atrocities. And this covers mass atrocities not only during World War II, but really throughout the 20th century. So the first bolded term in this chapter is Armistice Day. That was the day that the fighting stopped in World War I, November 11th, 1918. And in total, between 8 million and 9 million soldiers died in World War I, with more than 21 million wounded. Then civilian casualties are anywhere from 6 million to 13 million, just staggering. And during World War II, not even counted in the war deaths, would be the Armenian genocide. So in Turkey, starting in 1915 and going into 1917, the Ottoman Empire operated a genocide against the group of Christians called Armenians. And between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died in Turkey. This was the first genocide of the 20th century. And the word genocide means the attempted killing of an entire group of innocent people based on their race, religion, or ethnicity, just trying to wipe them all off the earth. That does not get more evil than genocide. Another atrocity that took place was the influenza epidemic. Not that that was intentional, but it still killed millions of people. About 20 million people worldwide were killed. The epidemic became a pandemic, which is a disease prevalent over a large area or the entire world. India alone may have lost 7 million people to the disease, and it came from when soldiers came back from the war in Europe. They brought the disease back with them. You also, because of the destruction and carnage that took place during World War I and the Armenian genocide and the Russian Revolution and Civil War, plus the pandemic disease, it left a lot of people in the 1920s really hopeless, really aimless. I mean, we were told at the beginning of the 20th century that this is going to be a century of progress and peace and everything's going to be great. And then we see that we're actually just using this great technology to kill each other. And so the people who grew up around that time are known as the lost generation. And this was used to describe influential people of that generation. So writers, especially living in Paris after the war, they described the suffering and the shock from the war that so many were experienced and how people really lost faith in humanity at that time. Another atrocity that took place shortly after World War I was the famine in Ukraine. This was a manufactured famine, something that Joseph Stalin and the Soviets intentionally did. They deprived the Ukrainians of grain, and it killed between 7 and 10 million Ukrainian people from 1932 to 1933. This genocide is known as Holodomor. Then, of course, there is the Holocaust. So the Holocaust, you have Heinrich Himmler, who was the leader of the Nazi Special Police, or the SS. He oversaw the policies that became known as the Holocaust. 7 million residents of conquered territories were forced to work in labor camps or contribute to the war effort. What started as the Nuremberg laws that banned Jews from certain professions and certain schools eventually led to Jews being forced to live in sections of cities called ghettos, and then eventually being taken away to concentration camps, mainly for extermination. This was a part of what Hitler called the final solution to the Jewish question, or the Jewish problem. And this is the most well-known genocide of the 20th century. Over 6 million Jewish people were murdered during these 6 years. The Japanese also committed many atrocities, including the rape of Nanking, or the Nanking Massacre, in which they killed hundreds of thousands of residents, innocent people of the city of Nanking. Under their program Asia for Asiatics, Japan forced people they had conquered into labor programs. So the Japanese had labor camps, the Nazis had labor camps, and the Soviets had labor camps too. Really all different versions of concentration camps, just by different names. The Allies also did commit some atrocities. For example, there was the firebombing of German cities, particularly Hamburg and Dresden, which caused tens of thousands of deaths. The U.S. also firebombed Tokyo, which killed even more people than the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even getting to long after World War II, you have genocide continuing into the late 20th century and even into the 21st century. For example, in Bosnia, in the 1990s, you have a genocide carried out by Slobodan Milosevic, who was a demagogue who took control of Serbia after the fall of Camera cut out, sorry about that. So just to conclude this final chapter here, Slobodan Milosevic carried out horrific acts of ethnic cleansing against Muslims from Bosnia and Kosovo, killing or driving people from their native lands. And over the course of Yugoslavia's period of balkanization in the 1990s, which was the disintegration into separate states after the collapse of communism in Yugoslavia, about 300,000 people were killed. Also in the 1990s, you have a genocide in Rwanda, which is a nation in Central Africa, in which you have two tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis. So the Hutus were the majority, and they killed close to 1 million of their rival Tutsis, the minority tribe. And over the course of about 2 months, from April until June of 1994, between 500,000 and 1 million civilians were slaughtered, mostly with machetes, and the rest of the world did very little until it was too late. And then one of the most recent genocides took place in Sudan in 2003 in a region called Darfur, in which the Sudanese government unleashed a group of Arab militants known as the Janjaweed, which literally translates as evil men on horseback. And they went out and burned villages, slaughtered more than 200,000 people, mostly non-Arab Muslim Africans, and led to a refugee crisis that spilled into the neighboring nation of Chad, and more than 1 million people lost their homes. Despite negotiations, appeals, and the International Criminal Court charging Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir with war crimes, the genocide continued. All right, so that is the end of Unit 7, Global Conflict, 1900 to the present.